Time to see this in a practical way. We're going to bring in the Blazor local storage package first. And then we are going to make the API client service smarter, so it will see if we have the data already available locally. When we in our application navigate from the overview to the details and back, each time an API call will be made. Because the overview component is basically being recreated, it will also reach out to the API. That can actually be quite a burden for the API. It creates quite some load. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a form of caching so that the data service will store the data locally and only refresh when necessary or after a certain amount of time. We could also do this with state, like we saw in the previous demo. But I'm now going to make use of this opportunity to also show you how we can make this data persistent. Maybe we want to store it for a longer time, even across application restarts. And then we can use local storage. Let me show you how. Now, working with the browser's local storage can be done entirely manually. We can use JavaScript interop to do this, but I'll instead use a package, the Blazor local storage package, and that already gives us this functionality, and we can just call its API. So I'm going to go to my CSprosh file again, and I'll add the Blazor local storage package. Save this, and that package will be downloaded. This package, as we already saw in the slides, gives me the ability to store data locally in the browser's local storage or session storage. We can retrieve items, add items, see if they're there, and so on. Before we do that, before we interact in fact with this package, we'll need to make a registration in the program. So in the services collection, I'll need to bring in support for the package by calling builder.services.add Blazor local storage. We get a red squiggly, and we can solve that by bringing in, of course, the correct using statement. So what I will now do is I'll go to my employee data service and enhance it with local storage. We'll bring in an iLocalStorage service instance. That is in fact coming also from Blazor local storage. And this will run through dependency injection. So we'll add another constructor parameter here. So now again, dependency injection and constructor injection will inject an iLocalStorage service instance, an instance that implements that interface, of course. So what I'll now do is I'll store my data locally. I'll create a form of caching. I will check if data is already there, and if it's there, if it's not, stale. If it's too old, I will reach out to my API again and get new data, and I'll store that also in local storage. That flow I'm going to paste in and show you the result of. The refresh required will be false by default. So if refresh required is false, then we'll use this block. I'm first going to check if an employee expiration key can be found. I've in fact added this local storage constants class, which contains the keys. They are just strings for my local storage. If an expiration key exists, then this code will execute, and I'm going to check if the datetime that is stored in there is greater than the current time. That would mean that the item hasn't expired yet. If we then can actually find the data with this key here, employees list, then we'll retrieve that from the local storage by using the getItemAsync, passing in the list key again, and returning the data as a list of employees. If, however, the refresh is required, or the data has already expired or cannot be found, well then we'll execute this code. We'll make a call again to API employee as we did before, and we'll store that in a list. That is, in this case, an IEnumerable of employees. And before we return that data, we'll store it in the local storage by calling the setItemAsync, twice in fact. We'll store the data and we'll also store the expiration time, which I've set 1 minute from now. This way, as long as the data hasn't expired, it will be retrieved from the local storage, hence reducing the number of API calls that I'm making from a Blazor application.